The wind was a blade honed on the endless plains, slicing through the thin hides the girls wore. 11 days they had wandered, since the sickness had taken the last of the women, since the scouts had vanished and the men gone in search, leaving the young ones behind. 10 girls, ranging from the one who was almost a woman, the one called Sheila, down to the 2 small ones who cried silently now, their tears freezing on their cheeks. The land offered nothing but biting cold and the vast, indifferent sweep of brown grass under a sky the color of bruised iron. Fear was a constant, cold knot in Sheila's belly, a reflection of the hollow ache of hunger. She was the eldest, barely 13 summers, but the responsibility weighed like a stone in her small chest. It was she who had spotted the thin column of smoke against the horizon 2 days past, she who had guided their stumbling footsteps towards it, praying it was not a trick of the weary eye. Now, a low structure huddled in a shallow depression ahead, barely more than a hump of earth and logs, but it was shelter. And there was the faint smell of wood smoke, a promise of warmth. Hope warred with the deep tribal warnings against the solitary dwellings of the Naina, the people of the houses, the white settlers. But desperation was a predator more immediate than any man. As they drew closer, the structure resolved into a cabin, small and rough-hewn. No stockade, no sign of other buildings. Just this one, alone against the immensity. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. Sheila held up a hand, halting the others. They huddled together, ragged and shivering, eyes fixed on the door. It was made of thick wood, barred from the inside. Was he alone? A man who chose this solitude was not like other men. He could be dangerous, cruel, but staying here meant death in the wind. Summoning a courage she didn't feel, Sheila walked forward slowly, her steps uncertain on the frozen ground. The other girls followed, a tight, fearful cluster behind her. She stopped several paces from the door and waited, trying to make her small figure seem less threatening, more pleading. The wind whipped strands of dark hair across her face. Time stretched, marked only by the relentless moan of the wind and the shivering of the girls. Then the heavy bar scraped back. The door opened inward a crack, revealing a sliver of darkness. A moment passed. Then the door opened wider. A man stood there, tall, gaunt, wrapped in rough blankets. His face was hidden in shadow, but his eyes caught the dull light, wary, remote, like stones. He didn't speak. He simply looked at the 10 small figures huddled in the cold. Sheila swallowed, her voice thin but clear in the wind. We have no place," she whispered in halting, careful Naina words, mixing in a few simple signs. Cold, hunger, no people. She gestured back the way they had come, towards the emptiness. The man's gaze swept over her, over the younger, trembling children. He seemed to consider them, weighing their need against what? His own solitude? His own safety? The silence hung heavy, broken only by the wind. His face remained unreadable. Sheila's heart hammered against her ribs. She expected him to close the door, to leave them to the plains. Instead, after what felt like an age, he stepped back, pulling the door wider. An invitation, silent and stark. Sheila hesitated for only a heartbeat, then guided the smallest ones forward. One by one, the 10 girls slipped past the threshold, into the dim, smoky warmth of the solitary man's home, leaving the biting wind and the vast, empty world behind them. The door closed with a heavy thud, sealing them inside. Inside, the cabin was sparse, clean, and blessedly warm. A small fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows that flickered over rough log walls and a packed earth floor. There was a narrow bunk piled with blankets, a sturdy table made of split logs, and a few simple tools hanging on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else, the quiet, settled smell of long solitude. The man closed the heavy door and slid the bar back into place with a resonant thunk. He turned, his figure silhouetted against the dim light from the single small window. Now Sheila could see his face properly. It was weathered, lined, with a heavy beard dusted with gray. His eyes, set deep, seemed to hold the weariness of many years alone. He wore buckskins and a faded shirt. His hands, when he moved them, were large and calloused, but his movements were deliberate, quiet. He didn't look at them directly at first, busying himself near the hearth. He added a log to the fire, then turned to a pot simmering over the coals. He ladled a thick, pale stew into several wooden bowls. Sheila watched him, her muscles still tense with apprehension, but the immediate, gnawing cold had receded, replaced by a cautious curiosity about this man who had given them shelter. He didn't speak, didn't gesture. He simply placed the bowls on the table. The smell was rich, unfamiliar. The girls, their hunger overpowering their fear, looked to Sheila. She nodded subtly, and they approached the table, their small hands reaching hesitantly for the bowls. Sheila took one too, the rough wood warm against her chilled fingers. She tasted the stew. It was savory, made with something she didn't recognize, roots and pieces of meat. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever eaten. The girls ate in silence, hunched over their bowls, the only sounds the quiet scrape of spoons and the crackling fire. The man sat on his bunk, watching them with that same remote, steady gaze. He didn't eat, he just observed. His presence was a heavy weight in the small room, not threatening, but profoundly solitary. As they finished, scraping the bowls clean, the man rose and took the empty bowls, rinsing them with water from a bucket near the door. Again, no words. It was a language of actions, of necessity. He gestured towards the floor near the hearth, the warmest spot. Sheila understood. They were to sleep there. She gathered the younger girls, arranging them close together for shared warmth. He didn't offer blankets, and Sheila didn't expect them. The floor was hard, but it was warm, dry, and safe from the wind. They huddled together, 10 small bodies, a single mass of vulnerability. Sheila lay awake for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin, the man moving occasionally, the sigh of the wind outside, the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping girls. She watched the man. He sat by the fire now, not sleeping, just watching the flames. His stillness was absolute. He was a guardian, perhaps, or a captor. She did not know. But for tonight they were warm. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the small window, a new sound reached Sheila's ears, faint at first, then growing louder, the distant drumming of hooves on the frozen ground, carried on the wind. It was the sound of many horses. Sheila's blood ran cold. The man's head snapped up, his eyes fixed on the window. He had heard it too. The sound grew, swelling from a distant murmur to a distinct thunder. There was no mistaking it. Many horses moving fast. Comanche horses. Terror, sharp and absolute, seized Sheila. Her own people. Why? The man rose swiftly, moving with a sudden, coiled energy that was startling given his previous stillness. He went to the small window, peering out cautiously. His expression hardened, becoming a grim mask. He turned back to the girls, his gaze sweeping over their still sleeping forms, then resting on Sheila, who was sitting up now, heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. His eyes held a directness that bypassed words, conveying a simple, terrifying message. Danger. Immediate. He went to the door, checking the bar, reinforcing it. Then he moved about the cabin, pulling items from hooks on the walls, a long rifle, a powder horn, a leather pouch. His movements were economical, practiced. The drumming hooves were closer now, surrounding the cabin. A low murmur of voices reached them, guttural and sharp. Comanche voices. Sheila could make out some words now, shouted commands. They were calling out, demanding. Not in a parley, but with authority, with menace. The girls were waking now, roused by the noise and the man's movements, their faces pale with fear. The smallest ones began to whimper. The man paused, looking at the terrified children huddled together. For a brief moment, the hard lines on his face seemed to soften, infinitesimally. He came over to them and knelt, his eyes meeting Sheila's. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, quiet but firm. The first time he had spoken since they arrived. "Stay down," he said, his voice rough, accented, but understandable. "Stay quiet." Stay away from the door. Away from the window. He didn't offer comfort, just instruction. It was enough. Sheila nodded, pulling the younger girls closer, whispering for them to be silent. Outside, the shouting intensified. The ground vibrated with the presence of hundreds of horses and men. Sheila crept towards the small window, keeping low as the man had instructed. She peeked out from beneath the sill. They were there, hundreds of warriors, circling the cabin, their faces painted for war, their lances and rifles glinting dully in the weak morning light. Their leader, a tall, imposing figure on a black horse, rode forward, stopping directly before the door. He raised a hand and the circling stopped. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the restless snorting of horses and the wind. Then, the leader's voice boomed, clear and demanding, in their own language. He spoke to the man inside. He demanded the girls, called them runaways, lost property. Demanded that the man open the door and surrender them, or face the consequences. The man stood beside the door, rifle held ready. He didn't answer. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken defiance. Sheila watched the man's face. There was no fear there, only a deep, quiet resolve. The tension outside was a physical thing, pressing in on the small cabin. After the Comanche leader's demand for the girls, there was a period of unnerving silence, broken finally by shouts of derision and challenge. Warriors rode closer to the cabin walls, testing the perimeter, their movements swift and aggressive. Sheila, huddled with the other girls near the hearth, listened, every muscle tight. The man stood near the door, rifle ready, a sentinel of grim determination. He didn't pace or show any sign of agitation. His stillness was a stark contrast to the furious energy swirling outside. The girls whimpered softly, clutching each other. Sheila held the two smallest ones close, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. She watched the man. He was their only defense, a single figure against 300. It seemed impossible. Suddenly, a heavy thud shook the cabin as something struck the door. Wood splintered. The man didn't flinch. He raised his rifle and fired through a narrow slit he had prepared beside the doorframe. The shot cracked loud in the small space, followed instantly by a yell of pain from outside. The warrior leader shouted again, his voice ringing with fury. Arrows thudded against the walls, some finding purchase in the logs, others glancing off. A few passed through the small window opening, embedding themselves in the opposite wall. The man moved quickly, pulling down a thick hide he used to cover the window, blocking the light but offering some protection. The cabin plunged into deeper shadow. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. The attack intensified. Blows rained down on the door, on the walls. The sound was deafening, terrifying. The girls pressed themselves flat against the floor, hands over their ears, trembling uncontrollably. Sheila risked a glance at the man. He was a figure of action now, reloading and firing with measured precision whenever a target presented itself through the firing slits or the damaged door. He moved with a surprising economy of motion, conserving his strength, his focus absolute. He took a blow to the shoulder from something heavy striking the wall beside him, staggering slightly, but he recovered instantly, raising his rifle again. He was defending them. This man, this stranger, was risking his life against his own people, for 10 lost girls. The fighting outside seemed to reach a fever pitch, a storm of shouts, hoofbeats, and splintering wood. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it began to subside. The intensity lessened, the blows became sporadic. The shouts changed, becoming calls to withdraw. The drumming of horses' hooves started again, moving away from the cabin. Sheila listened, barely daring to breathe. Was it over? The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the wind and the ragged breathing of those inside. The man stood by the door, listening intently. He didn't relax his guard. Minutes crawled by. The sounds of the retreating warriors faded into the distance. Only when the plain was silent again, save for the wind, did the man finally lower his rifle. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped slightly, his face grim. He turned back to the girls. The tension in the small cabin began to dissipate, replaced by exhaustion and a fragile sense of relief. He went to the door and slowly, cautiously, opened it a crack, scanning the empty plain. The warriors were gone. Sheila looked at the man, really looked at him. His face was streaked with sweat and grime, his breath coming in ragged gasps. There was a dark stain spreading on the shoulder of his shirt where he had been hit. He was injured, tired, but he was alive. And because of him, they were alive too. In the aftermath of the violence, the fear was still there, but something else had been born, a deep, wordless gratitude, a bond forged in shared peril. They had been lost, alone, facing death on the plains. He had been alone, seeking only solitude. Their paths had crossed, not by choice, but by desperate need and unexpected courage. He closed the door, sliding the heavy bar back into place. The cabin was damaged, scarred by the attack, but it held. He looked at the girls, his gaze no longer remote, but weary, perhaps even a little soft. He gestured towards the fire. "Warm yourselves," he said, his voice rougher now. He went to his bunk, sitting heavily, examining his injured shoulder. Sheila, shedding her fear, felt a surge of something new. She approached him hesitantly. He looked up. She didn't know how to thank him in his language. She didn't need to. The language of survival was universal. She simply looked at him, her eyes conveying the depth of her gratitude, the silent acknowledgement of what he had done. He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not the stoic emptiness of a solitary man, but the quiet, profound weariness of a protector. The world outside remained harsh, unpredictable. The plains held dangers both seen and unseen. Their future was still uncertain. The man's solitude was broken, perhaps irrevocably. The girl's journey was far from over. But in this small, damaged cabin, a fragile alliance had been forged. They had come seeking refuge from the world, and the world had followed them to his door. He had chosen to face it, not for glory or gain, but for the simple, fundamental act of protection. Sheila looked at the other girls, their faces still etched with fear, but alive. Resilience wasn't a fierce battle cry. Sometimes it was just the quiet, stubborn act of breathing, of finding warmth, of trusting an unexpected hand offered in the darkness. They were survivors, now bound to this man by the fire they had shared, by the danger he had faced for them. The path ahead was still uncertain, but they would face it together, 10 girls and a solitary man. Their lives intertwined by the arbitrary cruelty of fate and the quiet, unexpected strength of the human heart.